we should open up. Yes, Harsh, do you want to just use the mic, please? Because this is being sort of streamed live, so we need.
Hi. Jairam, I know you don't like to make judgments, but implicit in the entire narrative of the book uh, is a kind of appreciative stroke adulatory tone about the kind of role Haksar Saab played. Now, I have a very specific question, which is that for someone like Haksar, who saw himself as a, to use your word, as an unrepentant Marxist, you then either play with larger forces of history or you play with the idea of institutionalization. The specific role of individuals is somewhat less important. All right. If that in fact is correct, then to create an institutional environment within which you are going to rely so heavily on the ideological and personal integrity of individuals in those particular positions is a somewhat hazardous way to construct a state in difficult times. And let me end this by saying that I did not know Mr. Haksar particularly well, but I did ask him this question post-emergency in 77 when he was railing against an over-centralization of the state. And I did ask him that, I mean, to us it appears a little incongruous that someone who centralized authority so much in the PMO and was, at least in the understanding at that point of time in the 70s, the primary mover of centrally sponsored schemes and therefore changing the nature of federal relations, should today say that that's a dangerous turn. And he used somewhat colorful language, which I will not repeat, but basically saying, are we going to be condemned for our past? I mean, don't we have the right to reform? Now, I'm never very sure whether these are hindsight judgments of the individual or for us. And I think you quite correctly pointed out that one shouldn't use the languages of today to try and understand how people make decisions in complicated environments at that point of time. But my suspicion is that whichever way you cut it, there is an element of self-serving in the narrative, and I would like you to respond to that.
Well, I don't believe that Mr. Haksar centralized all authority in the Prime Minister's Secretariat. Look at the constellation of people around him. C. Subramanian, Mohan Kumar Mangal, K.D. Malikya, Prakriti Narayan, Jivan Ram, Sardar Swaran Singh. You've been heard after the 70s. None of them were pushovers intellectually. None of them were pushovers politically. What Mr. Haksar did, in fact, contrary to what most people believe, the Prime Minister's Secretariat of 1967 to 1973 quantitatively was the smallest. Quantitatively was the smallest. It was not even called Prime Minister's Office. It was called Prime Minister's Secretariat. And the average age must have been, in mid-30s at that point in time. And what Mr. Haksar did in the Prime Minister's Secretariat is not so much centralize authority as much as made the Prime Minister's Secretariat a clearinghouse for ideas that were coming in from different sources, in which he would, of course, put his input. It's not, I want to do everything on my own type of an approach. That the Prime Minister's Office is going to decide everything type of an approach. There was a lot of consultation. There was a lot of differences of opinion between the ministers and the Prime Minister, between the civil servants and Mr. Haksar, and none of the civil servants were pushovers. LPC was no pushover as Home Secretary. And Patel was no pushover. But I think Mr. Haksar saw his role as getting together all these different strands and ultimately trying to make sense of something that would be good for the country but also good for Indira Gandhi. That good for Indira Gandhi was always in the back of his mind. No doubt about it. And absolutely no doubt that his first and primary concern was how will Indira Gandhi, the person, be benefited from this. See, Harsh, I find it truly extraordinary. Srinath mentioned the example of how Mr. Haksar gets me and her into the office as his understudy to take over from him. I find it extraordinary how Mr. Haksar fights with the bureaucracy for I.G. Patel. I.G. Patel and Mr. Haksar were poles apart in terms of ideology. But yet, he was fighting the ICS because the ICS was not, allowing Dr. Patel to rise. And it is Mr. Haksar who facilitates that. So it's not true to say that he only promoted people of his own ideological ilk. If he saw a person had intellectual integrity, if he saw a person had ideas, would stand up for those ideas, would articulate those ideas, he would go out of his way to support. In the process, did he strengthen institutions or did he weaken institutions? He strengthened individuals. He didn't strengthen institutions. I mean, the evidence, I have to say, is the one institution he tried to strengthen was the public sector, and he failed. And he himself acknowledges that he failed. The judiciary, because of the bank nationalization and the Privy Purse judgment, one of January 1970, the other one of December 1970, created an extraordinary friction between the executive and the judiciary. And while the executive has been pilloried for this friction, the judiciary has got away scot-free. Nobody looks at what the philosophy of the judiciary was at that time. And let me give you one trivial example of this, which we have forgotten in our, collective memory. In 1967, when Dr. Radhakrishnan retires, Dr. Zakir Hussain is selected as the Congress candidate for the President of India. The opposition parties, primarily the Swatantra and the Jan Sangh, what do? Who is their common candidate against Dr. Zakir Hussain? A sitting Chief Justice of the government of the Supreme Court. Sitting Chief Justice, not retired Chief Justice. In all history books you will find retired Chief Justice Subbarao. No. A sitting Chief Justice is made the common candidate. The next day the sitting Chief Justice retires. Of course, he's got only 3 months to retire. However, the point I'm making is that you go to a sitting Chief Justice of India and make him your common candidate shows you which way the judicial thinking also. I'm not defending supersession and I'm not defending what the executive did in the 70s, but I think both contributed to the worsening of the relationship.
One is congratulations, because I've only heard Mr. Haksar speak many times, and what I'm going to say has relation to the question. The last few times was in the 90s, by when he was blind, and there was a talk on secularism, seminar. It was extraordinary because he quoted from 6-7 languages from memory, but what was evident is his idea of secularism drew on philosophical, religious, cultural traditions, which come from, folk and classical memory both. So he was someone very deeply rooted in Indian history with a genuine multilingualism. It's very difficult to imagine a figure such as that. I'm asking you because you have used the term that he was a Marxist all along. So in what sense do you think he was a Marxist? Because in this period, for instance, of the late 60s, early 70s, you referred to the period from 67 to 71, this is a period when, among other things, Mrs. Gandhi is also taking on some elements of the left. Most importantly, in all the state governments which are toppled, there is, Mr. Dharamvira and all of the things which happen in West Bengal. So actually was Mr. Haksar's historical role to draw on Marxism, notions of public sector, collectivism, all of this. But really to draw on that, not only to strengthen Mrs. Gandhi, the Prime Minister he was fairly loyal to, but to really strengthen a certain kind of state which would go on to crush left-wing forces. After all, it was also fighting, I'm not referring to Naxalites, I'm talking parliamentary Marxists.
On secularism, let me tell you, Mr. Haksar was extraordinarily harsh on his hero. There's no doubt that Nehru was his hero. But there are two cases where he tells Indira Gandhi that Nehru was absolutely wrong. He tells her the Nehru-Liaquat Pact of April 1950 was an error of judgment by Nehru. Because what it does, it gives the Muslims, it gives the Pakistanis a stake in the welfare of Muslims in India, and it gives India a stake in the welfare of Hindus in Pakistan. The protection of Muslims in India is the job of the government of India. The job of the Hindus is the protection of the government of Pakistan. So he writes one thing on this. The second thing he says, this is when he was in power. The second thing is when he's not in power, a few years before he dies, he writes a long tribute to Achyutaman, one of his great buddies, one of his great heroes, political heroes, Chief Minister of Kerala. And he then says, he defines secularism and how Indian secularism has got distorted by words like Dharam Nirpekshata, Panth Nirpekshata, and so on and so forth. And he says, goes back to the classical definition of secularism. He says, the state must have nothing to do with the public display of religion. Privately, we are Hindus, Muslims. He did not deny the fact that we are religious. And then he goes on to say that one of the cardinal errors made by Mr. Nehru was not to impose a uniform civil code in the 50s. And he takes Nehru to task on that. He says secularism means having a uniform civil code. But that came much later. The Liaquat thing is when he's in power. By the way, one of the things that I have tried to use in this book, and Srinath has been partially responsible for that approach, is I have given more credence to contemporaneous written evidence rather than written evidence, written 20 years after you are in power, because then you get sudden enlightenment and you can get different views. So what do you think when you are in power? And he used a wonderful phrase. He says, I would not give so much importance to the writings of a patriarch, right, when long past his twilight period. But you should focus on the writings and his notes on the time when he was in power. So judged in that, the question of in what way was he a Marxist? He was not a classical Marxist, Mahesh. He was not a classical Marxist. The CPM guys hated him, by the way. The CPI guys tolerated him for old time's sake. Well, the CPM guys didn't have much time for him. Bhupesh Gupta was really his buddy. Mohit Sen, that type, the Dange line. He saw Marxism, I thought, the way like Kosambi did, as a mode of inquiry, everything would get reduced to economic factors. Everything would be explained by class. Although, it's ironic, his master's thesis was with Malinowski, and he writes a paper on the Indian caste system. So it's not as if he is not aware of the role of caste in Indian society, but in most of what he writes and his speeches and the notes, it's the class argument that is coming out, not so much the caste argument. So to that extent, I think he remained a Marxist, but not a textual Marxist, but a Marxist who looked upon Marx as a way of looking at societal trends.
Just to add to that, I think one thing which does come out from the book quite strongly is that, the 1930s Marxist milieu, which you talk about, of when they're growing up, that is a popular front face, right? And that strategic orientation to politics remains, which is what I think helps when the tie-up with CPI, etc.
I think I must say that the popular front idea, I owe to Srinath, because it is really, he's a believer in the popular front. And in 1969, we have a popular front in India. When the Congress splits on the 12th of November 1969, the CPI, the DMK, the PSP, there's a popular front, there's a broad coalition. And I think this is what he was advocating to Indira Gandhi from day one, that we must bring progressive forces together. And even in the 1980s, after he has left power, he writes to Indira Gandhi and say, get all the old congressmen who were with you. And he gives the example of A.K. Antony, who has rejoined the Congress, said, get people like him back. So this popular front remained an important political construct in his mind.
Very briefly, sir, I'm a retired naval officer of fairly good age. So you brought a I congratulate you. A biography of this nature in Indian has to be congratulated. But my questions are two. One is, of course, I've written a book, two books. I had to correct my first book because of research. I said the Navy carried out the 71 attack, and it was proved 15 years later, and I was threatened that I shouldn't write it because the Navy was upset. It was the Air Force that did the first strike. So there are many things in history which, when it is researched very deeply, so I've just got your book, sir. I will research it in deep, because in both my books, and I looked, Srinath also, who's an expert of the 71 war, we definitely in March were told, are you ready for war? I was in the Navy, in a fairly good job. And Admiral Nanda also, and there's a big fight between General Jacob, who said, Manekshaw rang him up that we are required to go. And Jacob written the whole book telling him, I told him it's monsoon and all. So I just want a few words so that my research will continue, that you have said what Manekshaw agreed. I went to meet him in Stavaka. I met Air Marshal Lal before I wrote my book. My father-in-law was a legal advisor to Indian Airlines, did this thing. So I just want to know so that my research continues. He dramatized everything, absolutely. When I went to meet him, my wife and another very good-looking lady had gone. He opened the door and he said, ladies, come in. And then he just banged the door. We two were standing outside. And I said, listen, I've got this appointment. What is this, man? We were waiting. And Shivram is a very big man in London now. He opened the door and looked at me, and I can use the language. He said, you're Bhagat? You're Navy? I said, yes, sir. He said, if you will drink rum, come in. If you can't, get out. So he always dramatized everything. So I just want a few words. And just a personal thing. I grew up and born next to Pandit Brothers. So I saw that raid as a young man. What was it about? What was the relationship between Pandit Brothers? I was born next to Bhavnani and Sons.
Pandit Brothers was owned by the shareholders, Pandit Brothers. 80% of it was owned by Mr. Haksar's father's younger brother, and 10% of it was owned by Mrs. Haksar, Urmila Haksar. So it was a raid on, it was a message to Mr. Haksar, and it was followed up by 2 income tax raids on his house. After the Indian Airlines flight got hijacked in late January 1971, which many people attribute to Indian intelligence agencies, but I leave that aside. The fact that the Indian Airlines flight got hijacked, 2 days later, Mr. Haksar and Mr. Kao are writing to each other about military preparedness. And on the 2nd of March 1971, 23 days before the Pakistani army crackdown in Dhaka, 23 days before, Mr. Haksar sends Indira Gandhi a 5-page note which is reproduced here, saying that she should set up a task force to look at the military preparedness, military requirements, not only of India, but also of the people whom we are going to support across the eastern border. There is no question in my mind that by late January 71 and certainly early March 2nd, 1971, elections are going on. Mrs. Gandhi is somewhere in the election and he sends her this note. Long before the Pakistani crackdown, Haksar and Kao are thinking of military preparedness. But this is not the same as the Subramaniam Manekshaw view, which is we want war. That's not what they are doing. They are following a two-track strategy. Keep your military arsenal, whatever you have to do, buy. There are letters to Kosygin, there are letters to DP Dhar. This is what we want from the Soviets. All that is going on. But simultaneously, political engagement is going on, diplomatic engagement is going on, letters are being sent to heads of state all over the world. So it's a parallel thing, and there is an extraordinary letter from Jayaprakash Narayan to T.N. Cole, where he writes to T.N. Cole complaining against Mr. Haksar, saying, Haksar's attitude is putting off people in Bangladesh. What is India's policy on Bangladesh? There were people egging Mrs. Gandhi on. You should see the parliament debates of that period. Everybody was saying we must move in, we must move in. And there is a 20-page report by K. Subramaniam, which was circulated to everybody in government asking for quick military action. My point is not that the military aspect was ignored. All I am saying is that they were following, as Dasgupta says, a multiple strategy. They were following a diplomatic strategy, there was a domestic political strategy, there was military preparedness. They wanted at some stage to get the Soviets. Till April of 1971, it did not appear that the Soviet Union was firmly on our side of the wicket. It's only later on that, after August, that things become much clearer with the Soviet Union. So 1971 is a much more, and this is not a history of 1971. That's been written by Srinath. This is a history of 1971 as seen by one man. It's a history of 1971. I found an extraordinary letter from Golda Meir, Israeli Prime Minister, to an Israeli armaments manufacturer, Zabludovics, who supplied arms to India in 1971, and Mr. Haksar's friend. And I met Zabludovics, his son. I met his son. His son told me about how Mr. Haksar and Shlomo used to meet in London in the 60s and how they were great buddies. Mr. Haksar reaches out through Mr. Kaur, obviously. So all these I have mentioned, but it is not history of 1971. Many things happened in 1971 which are not there in the book.
So my question is more of a methodical question as a student of history, which is that when you're dealing with biographies, and especially the biography of a gentleman like P.N. Haksar, who maintained such extensive accounts written during the present day when he was still in office, how do you keep a sort of a barrier or maintain the required checks and balances so that the historian in the future is not misled by the gentleman in the present? As Churchill himself said before, after he won the World War, that I know who's going to be the hero of the Second World War because I'm going to be the one who's going to be writing it. So how do you, and there is nothing else to, the amount of writing at that time coming from the Prime Minister's Secretariat was also very limited. So how do you cross-check it? How do you maintain the right balance between self-aggrandizement and actual historical accounts?
Well, it helped that I am aware of many of the personalities and many of the events of that period. Not that I lived through it, but through my own personal contacts and reading of the situation. However, the question that you raise is very important. And there were occasions in which I myself was racked by doubt as to whether I should include this or not. One of the criticisms of this book from some of my colleagues in my party is that it takes the sheen off Mrs. Gandhi. It shows Mrs. Gandhi to be dancing to Mr. Haksar's tune. That's one criticism. I thought about it when I was writing. If I were to say that the stray thoughts note was not Mrs. Gandhi's, was actually Mr. Haksar's, or the letters that were written to Mr. Nijlingappa were not Mrs. Gandhi's, I don't think it devalues Indira Gandhi. I think Prime Minister is not going to have time to send a 6-page letter, point by point rebuttal if somebody is saying. Or Prime Minister. I think the only exception to this rule is Mr. Nehru. And he would have done better if he had somebody like Haksar with him, actually, dealing with all his correspondence and dealing with his office work. And there's a story about that which I will relate a little later. But But there was one occasion where I actually almost censored the material on my own. There's nothing I have censored. Whatever is in this book is there in the archives. You can cross-check it. But there's one thing, on one occasion, when I really was in a fix. 6 months before Haksar dies, in March, months before he dies, he writes a letter to Bakul Patel, who is the wife of Rajni Patel, one of his oldest buddies from the London days. And Bakul Patel, and a congressman, who also fell out with Sanjay Gandhi. Bakul Patel writes to Mr. Haksar. Mr. Haksar writes to Bakul Patel, "My dear Bakul, I've read your article. You have described me as the conscience keeper of Indira Gandhi. How could I keep something which did not exist?" Now, when I saw this letter, I had one of two choices. Just forget the letter existed, or actually include the letter. So I slept on it for 15 days. Then I said, let me go through more. Maybe there's some material after this letter. It so happens that a couple of days later, it's there, both these letters there are in the book, by the way. He writes to Catherine Frank, who is Indira Gandhi's biographer. "My dear Catherine, I'm so glad you're writing this biography. You must go here, you must go there. You must see all the places that Indira used to go. She was a mother, she was a wife, she was a prime minister, she was a leader, she had a body, she had a soul, she had a spirit. You must capture everything of Indira Gandhi." Completely different sort of a letter to Catherine Frank. So now I have this letter to Bakul Patel and I have the letter to Catherine Frank. How do I explain a man who within a few weeks goes from total condemnation of Indira Gandhi to somebody who is actually saying that, look, do justice to Indira Gandhi? So this took me a long time. And finally, I read a book by a professor, you must have heard of him, Stephen Greenblatt, who's written he's a scholar of Shakespeare, and he's written a large number of books. And there's a phrase in one of his books which just stuck in my mind: late life melancholia. So I have described this as late life melancholia, with due respect to many people here. That there comes a time in all our lives when we think that we haven't done what we should have done, or that what we had done has been negated by other things that have been happening. And the only way I could explain this paradox of these two letters was taking recourse to this explanation of late life melancholia. So the job of a biographer, in my view, is to bring out warts and all. It is not to be self-selective in the material. You have to be honest to the subject, and to be honest to the subject, you must bring out not just the positives, but you must bring out the criticism, what are the negatives associated with it. However, without necessarily being judgmental, but by being factual. I think that's the one point, since you're a budding historian, I'm sure, and a budding biographer, two things I would say about Indian biographers, with notable exceptions like S. Gopal. And Indian biographers depend very heavily on oral history and recollections and memories and memoirs, which are notoriously unreliable. Very few biographies, again, people like Gopal, exception, Sitapati, another exception, a recent exception. Primary material does not figure extensively in Indian biographies. And secondly, biographies end up being judgmental. They are not embedded in a chronicle of the times. I think it's more useful to allow people to make up their minds after reading the biography than for you and your biases to be evident in every page of the biography.
Hi, this is Dhananjay Vaidyanathan. I work for a non-profit in health and education. So my question was, one of the things that this discussion has brought to my mind is the enormous influence that a person can have on an elected, directly or indirectly, official. So the question is, are there sufficient, checks and balances to a power of such a person? Malcolm Gladwell in a recent podcast talks about understanding the friends and advisors of key people to understand history. So do you think those mechanisms exist, and if not, should there be such mechanisms?
No, a person like Mr. Haksar is rare. I think the only person who has come close to Mr. Haksar in the relationship with the Prime Minister is Mr. Brijesh Mishra, who had a similar equation with Mr. Vajpayee. I mean, they had a spiritual relationship as well, I'm sure, which was not the case of Mr. Haksar and Mrs. Gandhi. But the Vajpayee-Mishra relationship was not just professional camaraderie, but also a great degree of personal warmth. And all these are important for policy making. Formal structures explain only so much. Decision making takes place in a world where there are informal networks, there are friendships, there are irrational sentiments very often. All of us who go through professional schools come out with the notion that decision making is a rational enterprise. Decision making is not necessarily a rational enterprise. There are multiple factors, multiple forces at work. So individuals do play a role. I mean, this is a perennial debate going back to the days of Thomas Carlyle. Are processes more important? Are individuals more important? I tend to take the view that individuals make the processes. I've written a book on 1991, and there is a view that whoever was the Prime Minister, whoever was the Finance Minister, economic reforms would have taken place in 1991. I tended to discount that because you needed a Manmohan Singh, who was a strong leftist, who was a very middle of the road, cautious man, to sell the idea of liberalization. And you needed Chanakya, a fox, like Mr. Narasimha Rao, to manage the politics associated with the transition. So individuals play a very important role. I don't think you can divorce systems and processes from individuals.
Just an idea, Jairam, but this is to take off on your view that a leader necessarily has to have a conscience. You know what I mean? There's a public conscience and there's a personal conscience. Now, personal conscience cannot be communicated by its very nature. No, I know, but you did make the distinction, and the gentleman there talked about conscience and how you juxtaposed one against the other. Now, my point is, just a curious thing, I haven't read your book, I will, but does a good leader necessarily have to have a good public conscience?
If you want to...
By public, I mean he has to make evident his conscience.
Gandhi. You take the example of Gandhi. You take the example of Nehru. You take all these. These are people who laid bare their conscience in public. And their private fears and private doubts became matters of public debate and public discussion. Maybe the times are different then, but I think people will react to people. People will react to leaders who are seen to be laying their conscience out in public, and not have a dichotomy between their private conscience and their public conscience. I think that's very important. And my view, successful political leaders throughout history, not only in India but in elsewhere, are people who have somehow been able to manage. There'll always be some amount of hypocrisy. There'll always be some amount of what you do in private and what you do be in public. There will be a difference. But the successful leaders are those who minimize that difference.
One last question then.
Jairam, you've written a very good book. It's highly readable. I have gone only about half of it, so maybe my comment, observation will not be justified. I'll stand corrected when I read the rest. You said the pivot of policy in that time was Mr. Haksar. I knew Mr. Haksar, I worked with Mrs. Gandhi. Haksar I knew since 1949. We worked together in the Ministry of External Affairs. He was a very kind friend of mine. Some of these notes, Haksar's notes, I believe Indira Gandhi would have just set them aside. She hated notes. In fact, she comments in one of the notes in the sections I've read. Secretary likes to write these long notes. I'm not amused. And this was a story from note 1 till the last note he wrote. I know for certain that not from 71, even from 69, there were differences between the two on India's American policy. The impression here is that it was all formed by Mr. Haksar. Mr. Haksar, I was sent as deputy ambassador or minister with the rank of ambassador to Washington to keep a check on L.K. Jha. He was shunted out of here because Mrs. Gandhi felt that she had been misled by him very largely, also B.K. Nehru. And a hiatus grew between Nehru and Indira Gandhi also. There are other instances. When I've finished reading the book, I would like to discuss this with you. You see, your handicap is that one of the intertwined lives you have no access to. She has left no archives. For 3 years, I was a foreign secretary. When I came, there was a dispute about American policy. Should we make up with America or not? And my view was that we should now make up with America. I ran into a conflict with P.V. Narasimha Rao, who was the foreign minister. G. Parthasarathi was the advisor. And Indira Gandhi set them aside, accepted my advice, and went to Washington. But that is apart. She was her own person. I believe, 69, I've given you an example, right from 67 onwards. So I think at some stage when you bring out a second edition, you may have to correct the perspective a little bit. But I say it's a very good book you have written. Books of this kind are needed. Your style is marvelous. I enjoyed reading it. A small correction on Haksar's posting to Nigeria. Panditji had nothing to do with it, about his ability or Africa's importance. It was the bureaucratic functioning. Haksar had been in London, which was station A for donkey's years. He needs to go to Africa now. There was a lot of discussion about this in the Ministry of External Affairs at the time. I was here at the time. And, they sent him to Nigeria. He did some good work there. He did good work everywhere. Having shunted out L.K. Jha, Indira Gandhi was casting her eye around. She wanted a person she could trust, she could confide in, who would give her advice based on experience. She picked on Haksar. She knew Haksar before, from much earlier than their days in London. But as I said, if you had her archives, she had left none, unfortunately for us, you see. With me, the experience was, Foreign Secretary, don't send me notes. Come and talk to me, and you go back and you can write something else on the files. You can write what you like, but come and talk with me. We'll take a decision. I want you to implement it, which I did. Sometimes I recorded 10 lines, 6 lines for the benefit of the officialdom who had to deal with the consequences. I have a feeling, I have great respect for Haksar. We had a relationship of very deep affection. I'll show you some letters that he wrote to me, personal letters. Maybe some of these notes were written after discussion with her. In fact, not maybe, I think every note virtually he would have written after discussion with her, for history making. He was very conscious of this, I think, history, record, archives, and so on and so forth. But I thank you for the book, for writing this book, and for this discussion.
So I take your points. There are many notes he has written which can only have been written after having a discussion with Mrs. Gandhi, no doubt about it. But there are, however, some notes which he has written on which Indira Gandhi has had a different view, which, as it turned out, events showed. But for the most part, to defend myself, I have to say that what I tried to do with his note was to correlate it with events as they actually unfolded. And it's only then that I have included that note. The Stray Thoughts note, the final version, Subramaniam's version, Haksar's version. The letters to Nijlingappa, Subramaniam's version, Haksar's version, Indira Gandhi's final letter. I have done that comparison. So by and large, most of these notes are notes which, for example, sir, movement of ministers. He has given notes in 71. Who should be included? Who should be dropped? Those people. Now, I'm not saying that Mrs. Gandhi didn't have Mohan Kumaramangalam in mind. I'm sure she had Mohan Kumaramangalam in mind. But the portfolio that Mohan Kumaramangalam should get, the portfolio that Nandini Satpathy should get, that is there in this note. It may have been after the two had had a discussion. You are 100% right. And the handicap is that this is archive of one life. It's not the archive of two lives. And no amount of my defending will detract from that. No doubt about it. Absolutely.
Can't help but ask you this, and this conversation particularly pushes me in that direction. You've lived with Haksar for a long while, and you've lived with the nature of this of that relationship and what it led to. You yourself have been in a position of as a minister of decision making. And it's a complex, candid, open, and it has many multiple pulls and pressures. The nature of this relationship. The bureaucracy today is quite different. The nature of that relationship it forges with its politicians is different. What of this did you miss? And what of it did you think is better not to have had in your relationship with your secretaries?
Well, for one, it's obvious. The relationship I had with my people who worked with me was a professional relationship. It's not a personal relationship of the type that Mr. Rasgotra is talking about. Number one. And number two, we are no longer living in a world of ideology. Ideologies are not the driving force in Indian political life. It's pragmatism. It's what can work. So gone are the days of big debates, which used to characterize Indian policy in the 60s and 70s. It was an ideological debate, a lot of ideological debate in Parliament and outside. So that's the nature, the context is different now. Also, the fact is that the people who are coming into the civil service are quite different from Mr. Rasgotra's generation. People are coming to the civil service now, average age is 30, this is the fifth attempt or the fourth attempt, they're coming into the civil service, and they're coming into civil service because there's nothing else. Many times they've tried many other options and they're coming into the service. But that generation, the Haksar, the Rasgotra generation, was different. So you had a different set of people. How you had? I think one thing I would urge you to do when you read, if you read the book, is not to draw any contemporary lessons from the book. Please read this book. Please read this book as a book of the 60s and 70s, and not as who is Mr. Modi's Haksar, or what does Mr. Modi have done.
So one of the really amusing anecdotes in this book, and there are quite a few, is the publication, I think in the year 1970, of a memoir by a former director of the Intelligence Bureau, a man called P.N. Malik, who was very closely associated with Jawaharlal Nehru for many years. And Malik publishes this memoir of the sort of China war and the run-up to it, which gives extraordinary details. And P.N. Haksar gets a note saying that, listen, we should slap the Official Secrets Act on him. He has divulged so many secrets. It's such a sensitive relationship. He has told everything about forward policy, etc., etc. So Mr. Haksar actually writes saying that, listen, yes, on the face of it, yes, it's a clear violation of the Official Secrets Act. But I've also gone into it and understood that actually Mr. Malik was given an office by the IB when he was writing it. He had access to the telephone and most likely documents as well. So in a sense, this has been done with full official complicity. And so invoking the Official Secrets Act in this case would be sort of counterproductive. And as I read that, I was just wondering that a man who knew the ins and outs of the workings of the Official Secrets Act actually left behind such an archive. And we are glad that you were there to make use of it and give us this book. Thank you.
To complete your anecdote, what I have said in the book is that if the Official Secrets Act were to be slapped on me, I'm a perfect victim, because actually the top secret notes that Mr. Cow and Mr. Arun Shuri called me after reading the book and said that he and Mr. Cow's family have known each other for 50 years, but he had never seen Mr. Cow's handwriting. And finally he has seen Mr. Cow's handwriting. Top secret, from Ramji to Mr. Cow. That will fall under the Official Secrets Act. But I don't think people in government is going to read this book anyway.
Anyway, thank you so much, Jairam. Thanks so much. Yeah.